صدا میرسه؟ هفته هشتمین نشست کانون کتاب تورنتو، خوش اومدین. پوزش میخوام از این جابجایی، به ما گفته بودن که این اتاق حاضر نیست، جای ما رو عوض کرده بودن، به هر حال گفتگوی شد و توافق کردن که برگردیم سر جای اول. امشب همونطور که اطلاع دارین پروفسور آبراهامیان برای ما صحبت میکنن. نشست امشب قرار بود که در ماه فوریه برگزار بشه، به دلیل طوفان برفی که داشتیم در فوریه متاسفانه کنسل شد نشست و منتقل کردیم به جولای و دکتر آبراهامیان با من پذیرفتن که دوباره به تورنتو بیان و برای ما صحبت کنن. تعدادی از کتاب‌های ایشون از همین کتاب کودتا بیرون هست. دوستانی که علاقه‌مند هستن تهیه کنن و پس از پایان جلسه. همطور که میدونین این نشست به زبان انگلیسی خواهد بود. ایشون به انگلیسی صحبت میکنن. قبل از شروع صحبت ایشون اگر اجازه بدین چند تا نکته رو خدمتتون بگم. نشست ویژه‌ای داریم در پنجشنبه 25 جولای. آقای شاهرخ مشکین قلم، هنرمند شناخته شده کشورمون، تحقیقی کردن در مورد میرزاده عشقی. در پنجشنبه 25 نگاهی خواهیم داشت به میرزاده عشقی از دیدگاه شاهرخ مشکین قلم. و با این نشست این فصل از نشست‌های کانون کتاب به پایان میرسه. در ماه آگوست جلسه نخواهیم داشت و باز دوباره در سپتامبر همدیگر رو خواهیم دید. در ماه سپتامبر آقای دکتر ابراهامیان جهانبگلو کتاب تازه خودشون رو معرفی خواهند کرد درباره دموکراسی در ایران و جنبش نان وایلنس. همطور که میدونین برگزاری نشست‌ها بدون کمک‌های مالی شما امکان پذیر نیست. لطف کنید کمک‌های مالی خودتون رو در این صندوق که خواهد گردید برای ما بگذارید. کسانی که علاقه‌مند هستن ایمیل‌های کانون کتاب رو دریافت کنن، برگه دست به دست میگرده. خواهش میکنم که ایمیلاتون رو برای ما بگذارید. یک متن کوتاهی من تهیه کردم به زبان انگلیسی. با اجازهتون این رو خدمتتون میخونم و بعد پروفسور آبراهامیان صحبتشون رو شروع خواهند کرد. An American born in Iran and raised in England, he received his MA at Oxford University and his PhD at Columbia University. He teaches at the City University of New York, where he is distinguished professor of history at Baruch College. He has taught at Princeton University, New York University, and Oxford University. Abrahamian was elected as Fellow of American Academy of Arts and Science in 2010. His publications include Iran Between Two Revolutions, 1982, the Iranian Mujahideen, 1989, Khomeinism, 1993, Tortured Confessions, 1999, Inventive Axis of Evil, A History of Modern Iran in 2008, and the Coup, کتابی که امشب در موردش صحبت میکنم، The CIA and the Roots of Modern U.S.-Iranian Relations in 2013. In the Coup, Professor Abrahamian conveys facts and views clearly. He covers a great deal of ground in less than 300 pages. His research is comprehensive, and his understanding of the subject, as expected of a scholar with his caliber, is outstanding. His drafting crystalline and at times engagingly witty. Among the valuable services his book renders is a deconstruction of multi-layered game that Iran-British petroleum relation constitutes, where the real interests and intentions of each side is deciphered. He addresses with great sophistication and at times amusingly the political strategy and psychological cultural dimension of a relationship that always risks in inspiring fear and loathing in Iran and indifference and neglect in the US and England. He is excellent on demonstrating real influence that BP had on almost every aspect of Iranian social and political life. The impression he leaves is a British petroleum modeling through the Iranian front while Iran fights hard for its corner. The book represents a striking and welcome break from the drift of recent reductive methodologies, a spiral of unending discussion about Mossadegh al-Sultan's failure in striking a deal. Unlike other texts on the subject, this book takes a comprehensive look at the nations and corporations behind the coup. He has access to materials not previously available, which help prove his point even more, an essential read for those who really want to understand Iran. نکته اساسی که پروفسور آبراهامیان تو این کتاب بحث میکنن بحث کنترل، اینکه شرکت نفت ایران و انگلیس در واقع نه تنها کنترل تولید و فروش نفت رو داشته، بلکه در تمام ابعاد سیستم اجتماعی و سیاسی ایران کنترل داشته و در واقع دعوای مصدق بحث بر سر کنترل اداره کشور و کنترل منابع نفتی کشور بوده و به همین دلیل هست که نهایتاً شرکت نفت انگلیس حاضر نشد یک قرارداد آبرومندانه‌ای با ایران امضا کنه، به خاطر اینکه کنترل رو از دست میدادن و در واقع باید جمع میکردن میرفتن. خیلی خوشحالیم که دکتر آبراهامیان اینجا هستن. It's a blessing to have you here. And ladies and gentlemen, Professor Abrahamian. And last moment, if I could ask please to turn off your
Thank you for inviting me for the 78th session of Qanun and Kitab. I hope we'll all live to see many more sessions of Qanun and Kitab, maybe 278 more sessions. You may wonder why another book on the Mossadegh period and the coup. As you all probably know, there's been much written on the oil crisis and even more written on the actual coup. What can one say new about this whole period? A short period, 1951-53, but since it's been covered so much and so thoroughly, what can there be possibly new to say about this? Well, the reason I actually started doing this book was that the more I read the primary sources, especially the British Foreign Office sources and the British petroleum sources, both of them which are of course available. Still, there's a considerable amount that's still censored or still classified, but there's enough there to be able to figure out what was happening. The more I got convinced that the conventional wisdom of this period basically had two major mistakes. The first mistake is an argument that you see repeatedly stated, even by people very favorable to Mossadegh, is that he could have reached a compromise, and that he was offered a compromise, and it was due his inability to reach this compromise that eventually the crisis occurred. You find this argument, even as I said, very favorable authors that deal with Mossadegh. Homa Kartuzian, who you probably all have read, In his biography of Mossadegh, he writes, of course, Mossadegh is his great hero, but he made this one fatal mistake. He couldn't bring himself to compromise. And a very recent two books that you may have also read, Kinzer's book, this again is very flattering, of Mossadegh. He argues again that he could have reached a compromise, but he failed, and this was his strategy. And just in the last year, a new book came out, even more favorable to Mossadegh, Christopher Larg's book. He did extensive research in Iran, obviously talked to people who knew the Mossadegh period. He also comes to the conclusion that Mossadegh's failure to reach a compromise was that basically the tragedy. Now, these different authors have different explanations why Mossadegh couldn't reach a compromise, but their premise is that there was a compromise on the table, and if he'd been forthcoming, he could have then basically saved the regime and saved basically democracy in Iran. The second argument, conventional wisdom, is that the coup, yes, however mistaken it was, and people who are in favor of Mossadegh and all these historians I mentioned, argued that however basically bad the coup was and the consequences were disastrous for Iran, that it was done because of the Cold War, that it was the fear of communism that led the United States to actually carry out the coup, and that it has to be seen in the context of the Cold War and the US-Soviet rivalry. Can you hear me? Okay. I'll have to talk without notes, so.
Not for long.
Now, the more I worked on the primary sources, the more I found that actually neither of these two arguments hold much water. Because if you look at both of them, the primary documents showed that actually the compromise was never there on the table. There was no situation where Mossadegh could actually meet them halfway, because the British and Americans had never actually put on the table a compromise that was even feasible to accept. And the second argument I have is, the more you look at it, the fear of communism was basically an argument used for the public, for the media, and a way of legitimizing what was carried out. And that the people who actually carried out the coup themselves did not believe of the threat of communism. Their fear was actually much more to do with the question of nationalization, and the fear that if the nationalization of oil succeeded in Iran, this would have a domino effect, and it would affect basically the world. Of course, we know that eventually in the 1970s, oil was nationalized throughout the Middle East. Even conservative governments nationalized oil. But in 1951-53 period, this was considered unacceptable. In fact, you find people, oil company executives, American oil company executives, even arguing that if Iran succeeded in nationalization of oil, this would be, this is their own terms, the end of civilization as we know it, basically a disaster. So what I want to look at basically is these two arguments, these two issues about, was there a compromise ever offered, and also how much was the actual coup motivated by the fear of communism or the fear of the success of nationalization. Now, if you go back from the period, almost the moment oil was nationalized by Parliament, Majlis in '51, the British, right from the beginning in their reports, private reports or confidential reports, analyzed the situation quite, I would say, realistically. That if oil was nationalized, this would mean control of the production, export of oil would be in the hands of the Iranian state rather than the hands of AIOC. And this is right, from the beginning, the crucial word throughout the confidential documents is this simple word control. Who controls the actual production of oil? And of course, in any language you look at, the word nationalization means control over that production of that part of the economy. And although the word control is constantly used in confidential documents by the British, it is a word that really is very rarely used in public. So when the Americans are talking about, or the British are talking about it in public, it's never the question of who controls oil. It's much more a question of, are Iranians capable of actually doing this industry? It's very complicated. Would they be able to produce the oil and so on? They're inefficient and so on. There's usually a lot of racial stereotyping about how Iran is not really capable of doing it, and therefore they needed the British to actually drill, refine, export the oil. So here is, I would say, in terms of key words, the word control, which is never used in publicly, but privately it's always used by when they're dealing with negotiations. One of my professors a long time ago, Professor Izawi, was actually an economist who once suggested to the oil companies that he should write a history of the oil companies. And they said, no, you can't do that. It's too complicated. An academic, especially if someone with a liberal reputation, could never understand the complexity of the oil industry. So he did actually write a book. It's still available. It's a small book. And having written it, he sent it to Aramco and the other oil companies. And they came back, they had no problems with the book. The only problem they had was that he used the word control. They preferred to be certain that they owned the oil, but they didn't want the word control used. So here you find right from the beginning, the issue of nationalization for the British means loss of control. Who is it going to be lost to? It's to the Iranian state. And of course, for Mossadegh, this is exactly what nationalization meant, that the Iranian state would control the oil industry and would therefore be able to decide how much to produce, how much to export, who to export to. And this became from the very beginning a crucial issue. And of course you can see that this becomes a major issue worldwide, because if it's the oil companies that are in control of production, then they can influence the price of oil, where the oil goes to. If the states, local states, are in control, they can also determine it. And as I said, this happens in the 70s, but in 50s, this was considered completely outrageous, completely end of world of civilization as the oil companies knew it. And this is the argument the British, the AIOC used from the very beginning. The British used it, and they argued basically that we cannot give up control because this is essential for basically for the British, for Western economies. And the British remained consistent from the beginning to end that they were not going to give up control to the Iranian state. So from the day one, the day oil Majlis actually passed the nationalization bill to the very end, so end of Mossadegh, the British position was always consistent that they're not going to give up control. So whenever you had the negotiations, and there were a number of negotiations where it was Harriman going to Tehran, the British sending their own representatives to Tehran, whether it was Mossadegh in Washington negotiating oil. The position papers the British gave to the negotiators was that we are not going to lose control over production to the Iranian state. They were willing to share production control with other oil companies, but were not willing to give it up to the Iranian state. So the British position was very clear from the very beginning. Nationalization meant loss of control. They were not willing to give up control. Now, then the question is, what was the American position from the beginning? Now, in Iran, there was the misinterpretation that the US was in rivalry with the British, and somehow they were pro-Iranian on the question of oil. There were, of course, differences between the US and the British, but the differences was not really about the question of nationalization or control. The difference was actually about 50-50 agreements. The Americans had been pressuring the British before nationalization that they should give Iran a contract that would be 50-50 sharing of profits. And this difference between the British position and the American position misled many people in Iran to think that there was a great difference between the two, and therefore the US was more favorable to Iranian position. Again, when you look at the confidential papers, you find from the very beginning the American position was as much against nationalization as the British position was. In fact, as soon as the Majlis passed the bill, the American Assistant Secretary of State, who remained actually in charge of the whole Iranian desk, you can say, throughout the Mossadegh period, George McGee, got on a plane, rushed to Tehran to persuade the Shah that he shouldn't sign the nationalization law. And once he got to Tehran, of course, he discovered the mood was such that there was no way the Shah was not going to sign. Basically, the whole country was in 100% behind nationalization. So he gave up the idea that he was going to somehow block the nationalization law. So what McGee did, and remained consistent, was throughout the period he said on the public view that we are willing to accept in theory nationalization, but in practice Iran should not have control over it. An oxymoron. Nationalization obviously means control, but he was saying yes, in principle of course you can have a nationalization, but in practice Iran should not have control over production. And he uses actually the term facade and a cloak on his argument. And that this is basically, we present to the Iranians that, yeah, sure, in theory we're in favor of nationalization, it's a part of international law, we're quite happy with it, but when it comes to actually nitty-gritty of organizing and controlling the industry, Iran should not actually exercise that control. It would be like you had a big, basically sign, NIOC, and NIOC basically says we're running basically the restaurants, the swimming pools, and therefore we're in charge. But in fact, the decisions would be out of Iranian hands in either the British or a consortium of companies that would run the industry. So the American position really was no different than the British when it came to this question of nationalization. And the British didn't really have to work hard on to get the Americans on their side, because the American companies, oil companies, from the very beginning was just as opposed to nationalization as AIOC was. They realized what effects this would have on them in the Gulf, in places like Venezuela, in Indonesia, and you find, here again it's often not mentioned, McGee, in his negotiations with Iran, is also always negotiating with the American oil companies, assuring them that whatever happens, nationalization is not going to succeed. Because if it succeeds, the ramifications, of course, for the American companies would have been also detrimental. And the British, to basically rub everything into the ground, would try to do a list of all the assets that American companies would lose if nationalization succeeded. And of course, at that time already there was a question of the Suez Canal, and the idea was, well, if this becomes an epidemic and nationalization is going to become a worldwide phenomenon, this is going to affect, obviously, the American oil companies as much as the British. So from the very beginning, you can say there was really no difference between the American position and the British position on the question of nationalization. They agreed that in principle they accepted nationalization, but when it came to actually the nitty-gritty of negotiations, they would not give that, basically, give up that control. So you have often had these lengthy negotiations, and if you read the modern works on Mossadegh, they argued that, well, Mossadegh couldn't make up his mind. He tended to fluctuate. He kept on asking too many questions. But what was going on in the negotiations was Mossadegh was looking at actually the bottom line. Who is going to be in control? They would then try to barrage him, flood him with a lot of statistics, things that were not relevant, try to, in fact, take him for a ride and confuse him while they were making sure that actually control of the industry remained out of Iranian hands. And you could say the shrewdness of Mossadegh, his intellectual ability, is that he was not taken for a ride. He would always take the question back, who is in the final analysis going to be in charge of the industry? Iran or some other companies, foreign companies? And of course for him, nationalization meant basically sovereignty over the industry. And now, 50, 60 years later, you can wonder, especially younger people, you could say, well, why is this such an issue? It was, to go back to that period, it was very much an issue because it was a question of national sovereignty. After 1945, you have more and more third world countries becoming independent, regaining their sovereignty from imperial powers. You have places like India, Nigeria, Ghana, and so on. And in Iran, of course, since it had been a semi-colonial state rather than a colonized state, oil was an important issue because this was a way of showing basically to Iran itself that it was independent of the British. As long as the major industry in Iran remained in British hands, Iran was therefore seen as actually being controlled by the British. So getting control over oil was a way of getting independence, equivalent to the independence movements in the rest of the Third World. So that's why, again, older people don't need to hear this, but younger people should realize, for instance, when the flag, the Iranian flag, went over the headquarters of AIOC, it was a very potent scene because this was a way equivalent to the Indian flag going up in Delhi, it was sign of independence from a former colonial power. So it was very much, you can say, part of the nationalistic Third World movements after World War II. And this was a question where you can see there was really the impossibility of compromise, because it was a question of national sovereignty. Besides that, the British and Americans never put anything on the table that was in any way a compromise. Again, what they were saying is you can in name claim to have sovereignty, but we will continue to actually run the industry. So basically, there was no way anyone in Mossadegh's position could actually come to a compromise, since there was no compromise offered. The ones that were offered, if you want, in question time, offered always had tricks which he obviously could see through and was not willing to accept, because it would have meant actually losing control over production. Now, the second theme, that this was all basically to do with the Cold War, fear of communism, the danger of the two-day party, and therefore the CIA eventually was ordered to carry out the coup in order to save Iran from the evils of communism. Again, this seems to fit into the historical period. It is the height of the Cold War. It was arguments that was often used at that time to do anything to the fear of communism. And I don't want to deny the existence of the Cold War. Obviously, the Cold War did exist. The question is, how much did actually this coup of '53 really be seen in the context of the Cold War, or more in the context of the First World versus the Third World, North versus South, oil companies versus question of national sovereignty. Here, of course, if you look at public statements again, Eisenhower and people of Dulles always said, yes, it was done in order to save the country from communism. And this is what many of these historians still continue basically that theme. The fact is, if you actually then look at the concrete situation in '53, how much was there a danger of communism there or not? Now, during Mossadegh's trial, some of you probably read that, the prosecutor kept on harping back on the question of the two-day. Mossadegh always said this is basically a red herring. It's not relevant. The two-day party didn't have a single tank, didn't have a single machine gun. How were they going to overthrow him? He was, I would say, realist enough to judge the situation at the time. He also had enough information, both from military intelligence and also from his, actually he had a nephew who was also very close to the two-day party, so he knew what was going on in the two-day party to know that there was no preparation toward of carrying out a coup. So he had the realistic assessment that there was no danger from the left to his administration. Yet the American argument was that, yes, there was a threat, and this threat was going to be actually undo Mossadegh in a way to save the country. Therefore, the coup had to be basically planned. Now, if you look again at the documents at the time, you can say, well, did Eisenhower, Dulles and people really believe this, or is this a rationalization of the coup? And if you look again at what the CIA assessment was, the CIA reports, some of them published on what was going on in Iranian politics, they actually had again a fairly realistic assessment that the two-day party was not in a position to carry out a coup or overthrow Mossadegh. So if you were basically hard-nosed decision maker, and people like Eisenhower, Dulles were very hard-nosed, realistic politicians, I would say as realistic as their contemporary in the Kremlin, who once asked the question, pertinent question, how many divisions does the Pope have? It goes to the core. You know, if you're doing in politics, you want to know what the other side has. You want to know basically what their cards are. They knew that the communist threat did not really exist in Iran, but they were still using that argument to justify later on for their reasons for carrying out the coup. In fact, part of the strategy of the CIA, and you can see this in the Wilbur report. Wilbur report, you probably know, is the CIA assessment of the coup done right after the coup by Donald Wilbur, who was one of the main officials, instigators of the coup. There, what you clearly see is part of the strategy of the CIA is to blow up the two-day danger in order then to justify a coup. And so what they were feeding to the press, American press, was that the country was almost on the verge of communism, of being overthrown by the two-day party, and therefore what happened was basically a way of saving Iran from the evils of Stalinism. So you find often in the CIA, actually, what they were telling the press, and New York Times is a good place, you can see that, they were always exaggerating the size of the two-day party. And this, of course, then fitted into the justification. I'll give you an example. If the two-day party had a big demonstration in Baharistan, let's say of 60,000 people, the New York Times would say it was 100,000 people. Now, again, these guys would be people like Eisenhower were realist enough to know that organizing a demonstration, even if it's 100,000, is not the same as actually being able to carry out a revolution or a coup. It's one thing to organize a demonstration, to organize a strike, but to actually organize a revolution and a coup was not in the books. And the British always actually said that. They, right from the beginning, poo-pooed any danger of a communist takeover in Iran, because they said if things get bad, the army can always take over. They always basically said this was communism was a bogeyman that was used. You find this even with British diplomats who are still alive, who in their interviews actually describe the communism as the bogeyman of the time. The bogeyman obviously means you don't really believe in it, but you may use that argument to scare little kids or someone else. And often what you find in the justification afterwards is the example of Czechoslovakia. The argument was, well, it's true the two-day party was not in a position to carry out the coup, but look what happened in Czechoslovakia in 1948. The communists did carry out a coup, and therefore the same thing could have happened in Iran if the CIA had not carried out a coup. This, of course, misses the point that Czechoslovakia was a very different situation from Iran, highly industrialized society with a huge labor force, communist labor force, almost an urban, totally urban society. And of course, many of the ministries were controlled by communists even before the coup. Iran was a very different situation, and the British had a very good analysis in the CIA too, that in fact there was a great deal of forces in Iran that would have, in fact, prevented a communist takeover. Just to give you a simple fact, tribes such as the Bakhtiaris had 20,000 armed men behind them. The Jولای party didn't have a tank or a machine gun, but the Bakhtiaris had 20,000 armed men. You take together other tribes, Bashkais or Salons or Kab, you're talking about major private armies that would have been a major obstacle to any communist takeover. In fact, the Wilbur report shows that if the coup had failed, the CIA term was blowback. What would be the costs to United States if the actual coup had failed? In the blowback, they never actually list a communist takeover. Their contingency plan was that if Mossadegh survived, they would then resort to tribal uprisings, especially the Bakhtiaris, and they had already armed many of the tribes, had contacts with the tribes, and they knew perfectly well that they had these internal forces they could use if a military coup had not succeeded. So I would say the Cold War issue should be taken with a pinch of salt. It's part of the discourse of the time, that anything you did at that time could be justified on the grounds that it was, of course, to fight communism. But when you actually look at the situation, you see that in reality, that really was not a factor. Other examples I could give you, like Guatemala. The US carried out the Guatemala coup a year later on the grounds that there was a communist threat to Guatemala. After the coup was succeeded, the State Department asked the US ambassador in Guatemala to send him proof that there was a communist danger, and he said no, he couldn't find any such evidence. There was none, of course. But again, this was a good justification. You could go on to many other examples. So, being a discourse of the time, especially in the public, it was a good argument to use, but their main concern was actually the concern of what would happen if Mossadegh had survived having nationalized the oil industry, and what would that example be set for other countries, including countries where the US had oil interests. Now, having said this, then the question becomes, why are historians still, who were favorable to Mossadegh, why do they still use these arguments, especially the Cold War arguments? And they're really actually getting into the territory of American historians who tend to be either liberal or conservative, and their analysis of American history, especially American foreign policy. What you find in American historians, especially of a liberal or conservative persuasion, there's a fine sort of line which people are reluctant to cross. It's one thing to say that bad decisions were made, i.e. the coup was a bad thing to do because we know the consequences later on. A good book that illustrates this is a book called Good Intentions, which is about US policy in Iran. Good intentions, and those of you who know the Bible, you know this comes from the biblical quotation that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So here the coup was bad. It eventually led to a disaster, Khomeini, but it was all well-intentioned, i.e. the decision makers, Dulles, Eisenhower, were in fact well-meaning guys, good fathers, good husbands, good pet owners, good people. If they made bad decisions, it was because they basically were misinformed, miscalculated, or, more important in this case, because they were trying to save the country from the evils of communism. So it basically gives a good spin, twist to bad decisions were made. They were never made decisions for bad reasons or economic reasons or self-motivated reasons. It was all altruistic reasons. It may have been bad, but the motives were good. And of course you see this not just in Iran, you can see this in Iraq, in Vietnam, and so on. The road was paved with good intentions, but misinformation or miscalculation. And you find this becomes very much a way of justifying the coup, even if you think that the coup was eventually a bad idea. And this was obviously clearly what you could see in people like Roosevelt's book. He doesn't call it a coup, he calls it a counter-coup. His argument was that if the US didn't carry out the coup, there would have been a worse communist coup down the road imminently. So this was basically a way of saving the country from a worse disaster. And you find also in part of the trying to undermine Mossadegh's administration is constantly, besides inflating two-day strength and so on, constantly the argument that the regime, the administration of Mossadegh was actually full of infiltrators, two-day infiltrators who were gradually boring away and would take over. And then you look at who they were looking at, who these individuals were. Clearly the US didn't believe that, because the same people after the coup in the 50s, 60s came to the United States. So if they were considered actually crypto-communists or secret communists, it would have been impossible to actually enter the United States. So even the State Department wouldn't have believed this type of smearing of individuals. I won't get into names, but this was clearly the arguments they were using. That, of course, Mossadegh himself was not a communist, but there were people around him that were secret ones, and therefore they would have been internally take over the system. So in what you find actually in the Wilbur report, part of the whole strategy of undermining the administration before the coup itself was this constant idea that they were systematic infiltration of the system by communists, and that in fact, therefore, it was a one-way road to inevitable communist takeover. And actually what then you find is to prove their arguments, part of the CIA strategy was to print circulars, élamies, in the name of the two-day party, threatening people like Boroujerdi, Kashani Bek Bahani, threatening to kill them, which were then, of course, seen as communist danger, but it was actually the CIA itself that was producing the stuff, and therefore then arguing, here, you see there's a communist danger, but only the CIA knew that the CIA itself was producing those documents, those basically leaflets. Now, some of this stuff sounds like old hat to many of you, but if you look at even recent writings on the coup by, again, people who are fairly favorable to Mossadegh and unfavorable to the coup, still subscribe to this notion that it was basically done for good reasons. Mark Gazarowski actually is a good point. Mark, who spent a lot of time interviewing CIA operatives who were involved in the coup. He argues that from speaking to them, he knows that oil was never an issue. The fear of communism was the issue. Of course, the people who are doing the groundwork are not the people making decisions. Those are the people in Washington. It could very well be that the people who were on the ground in Tehran carrying out the coup were not thinking about oil, but they were not the decision makers. What the decision makers that you trace to Washington, there you find the stress is always what is going to happen really to oil industry, oil production. In fact, Gazarowski, reviewing this, my book, he says that his main criticism is that it's too much basically economical, because he says that oil was never an issue. He argues that in fact America embraced the idea of nationalization. It got Britain to embrace nationalization. And then in 1954, with the consortium, this actually endorsed nationalization of oil. Well, if you believe that, I hope you'll visit me in Brooklyn. I have a bridge I'd love to sell to you. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Abrahamian. I just wanted to make a comment that yes, on February we had the snowstorm. Last week we had rainstorm and widespread blackout. And today we had a little bit of taste of blackout again. But we still would like to think that we are living in a 21st century city. So, questions? If I could ask to please come here to the mic so other people could hear you. دوستانی که سوال دارن لطفاً تشریف بیارید اینجا پای میکروفون که صداتون شنیده بشه. خواهش دیگری که دارم این هستش که سوالاتون رو محدود کنید که بتونیم هرچه بیشتر سوال بگیریم و دکتر آبراهامیان بتونن پاسخ بدن.
Thank you very much. So your presentation indicates that you have very deep study in this issue. You rarely went back to your notebook or something before, so you have very present mind, and the topic is very present in your mind as well. Therefore, I think you are very qualified to ask you a few questions. Number one, was this event, I'm not saying Kudeta, I'm saying national uprising or whatever, event of the 28th of Mordad 1332, was it certainly to be happen? I mean, was it possible to avoid it, to deter this event of happening? Number two, you emphasize in your presentation on nationalization. So, really was the cause of this event nationalization? I mean, couldn't we Iranian from the top, from the Shah himself, and the Prime Minister, and the people, and the religious leader, Ayatollah Kashani, National Front, which Baghai and other people, couldn't we achieve nationalization without this Kudeta or national uprising, which the consequence is, as you know, as everybody knows, is crucial. It changed it was a turning point in our history, you know. So, there are many good written books in this regard. One is by Dr. Ali Mir Fakrous, The Pathological of, what was his I forgot his the total name, pathological of Fletcher, and another one by Dr.
Azimi.
Yeah, Azima.
Azimi.
So both of them, they indicate in this period of 12 years, from 1320, when the late Reza Shah the Great, he left the country willingly or forced to do so, whatever, the next Shah, Muhammad Reza, was not that, powerful, almost even like God. He tried to consider or respect the Constitution, because of people like Batai, people like Mossadegh himself came to power. What happened, Mossadegh, he got everything that any prime minister in country like United Kingdom has. He has the army, he has the police, he has the...
دوستان ببخشید اجازه بدید ایشون 2 دقیقه فرصت دارن صحبتشون.
Yet he tried to throw the regime down, cooperating with the communists. Was he liberal? He had law to, he dismantled the parliament, and he asked the parliament to give him authorization to be a law by himself. He was not a democracy. So I think the cause of this coup d'etat was the Cold War, and because of Mossadegh himself and the leftists who brought this disaster for our country. And thank you very much.
Well, you've raised many actually complicated issues. I'll try to answer one. Is what you say the event, how do you describe the event? One interpretation, of course, is it's a national uprising. The other interpretation, it's a military coup. Now, in recent months, I think recent year, there's been a revival of the notion that this was a national uprising. Okay, I didn't want to get into this because I don't think it's an intellectual question worth addressing. But since people seem to think that this is worth looking at, let's look at it. What's an uprising? Uprising is a major movement from below. And in Iran at that time, if you're talking about demonstrations, maybe not 100,000, but you're talking about basically 50,000, 60,000. So the National Front could organize demonstrations of 50, 60, so the 2 days. That I would say would be a popular, basically, movement in the streets. People who like to make that into an uprising, look at it actually. At most, you're talking about 3,000 people. Who are these 3,000 people? You can again look at the CIA materials. Who were these 3,000 people? Some were actually people, peasants brought in from the villages, trucks hired by the CIA. Some were, of course, Lutis, Chalvageshan with their groups. There were some groups, political parties, like Baha'ist Party probably were there. But the Baha'ist Party would not have had 50,000, 60,000 people. We're talking about a handful of people. So 3,000 is hard to push into a popular uprising. So at most, you can say there was an organized, basically, gangs rather than popular demonstrations, gangs. And they did not carry out, basically, Bistahashki-Wardar. They had acoustical effects. They were basically there to make noise. The coup was what it was, a military coup. 40 tanks came into the city from the various barracks. These tanks were organized by colonels. The colonels were organized by the CIA. It's true that without the colonels, they wouldn't have carried out the coup, but the CIA is, of course, here, I would say, a very determining factor to organize it. So when you get interesting phenomena, historical phenomena that people who argued that this was a national uprising, then there are no heroes. Who are the heroes then? You know, you would think of a national uprising, you would have actually people who would be considered by the royalists as heroes. Who's a hero? Bakhtiar, Barani, Akhabi, Daftari. So we have a strange historical phenomena that royalists argued this was an uprising. They don't actually figure of heroes. And so the new interpretation is, oh, blame it on the Akhuns. It was the Akhuns that did it. So if this was a popular uprising, why blame someone else for the uprising? Why not take credit yourself and say, no, it was the royalist officers who did it, 40 of them. Instead, the argument is, well, actually exaggerate the role of the clerics in the coup. Of course, they played some role, and here the royalist historiography tends to exaggerate the role of the clerics. It's true there were some clerics involved in the coup, but most actually clerics remained behind Mossadegh. I won't give you lists, but people like Talabani remained to the very end supporters of Mossadegh. So this was actually, I think, a problem, a mistake I made originally 30 years ago when I was first doing this, that I argued that the Mossadegh fell because there was a major split in the National Front with people like Kashani Baha'i leaving the National Front, and this undermined it and actually led to the coup. I was actually persuaded by a member of the CIA, Richard Cotton, that actually I was wrong. Why? Because he made a good point that when people like Kashani, Baha'i, Maki broke with Mossadegh, they didn't take many of their followers with them. Many of their followers actually remained behind Mossadegh. So these people, when they left, they remained isolated. And therefore, it's sort of ironic that now their role for people like Kashani is being exaggerated for carrying out the coup. So they were there, but they didn't carry out the coup. The people who carried out the coup were the military and the CIA. So one shouldn't be reluctant to use the term coup for this. Then the question about Mossadegh, was he a Democrat or not? I intentionally avoid loaded terms like Democrat, traitor, treason, and so on, because then you have to get into that trying to definition of what is a Democrat. Mossadegh, I would say, is a 19th century constitutionalist, and part of the Constitution, his interpretation, is the king, the Shah, should reign, not rule. And this was something he remained actually faithful to. So his problem with the Shah was the question about the military. Who controls the military? And here, I think there's a distortion. People tend to buy the Shah's view that he came to power in 41 as a constitutional monarch willing to be very different from his father. Again, if you look at the British Foreign Office archives, the Shah was no fool in 1941. He wasn't someone sitting back doing nothing. Right from day one, he was adamant that he was going to be in full control of the military. And anyone who trespassed on the military would get actually knocked down. So it wasn't just Mossadegh who had a conflict with the Shah about the military. If you look at Ghawam had a major conflict with the Shah. And the Shah always won over the question of the military. And the British have no delusions that what the young Shah wanted to do was not establish a constitutional monarchy, but to go back to his father's regime. And that was his aspiration. And of course that he accomplished after 53, thanks to the CIA. But somehow the notion that he was always, the Shah was a benign, laid-back person who didn't want to get involved in politics and was willing to leave it to the politicians. It's just not true when you look behind the scenes. The Shah is a very actually shrewd, calculating. I actually give him much more credit as a politician than most people do, that he knew exactly where power lay and how to work it. And this actually explains why he never, when oil was nationalized, he did not come out against nationalization. He realized this was the national cause, and that if he went against nationalization, this would delegitimize the monarchy. So he was, in fact, when McGee went there, basically the Shah told him, no way, I'm not going to basically destroy the monarchy by coming out against nationalization. And so he was very aware of Mossadegh's popular, basically, support as the national, basically, hero. And that if he went against Mossadegh, he would be then actually undermining the monarchy. And this way you could say this is his tragedy, a tragic figure. A tragic figure in the terms of like a Greek tragedy, that you know certain things you do is going to lead you to disaster, to hell. And he knew that, but he eventually had to do it because he had no choice. So even in the last days when the coup was being planned, the CIA had trouble getting the Shah actually to go along with the coup. Not because he was a constitutionalist or Democrat, but because he knew if he went with the coup against Mossadegh, he would be actually undermining not just himself, but the monarchy. So what did the Americans and the British do? They actually gave him an ultimatum. They said, we're going to do the coup, whether you're with us or not. We can't guarantee you're thrown afterwards. And since they already had Zayedi on board, this was a clear-cut threat to him that if he didn't go along with the coup, the military would take over and he would spend the rest of his days, I don't know, in Paris or London. And therefore, this was the way actually he participated in the coup, knowing well that this was going to discredit the whole Pahlavi dynasty. And this, I would say, if one wanted to write a biography of the Shah, is much more of a tragic figure, someone who was shrewd enough to know what was disastrous, but he was pushed by that. In a great tragedy, it's usually fate that forces you. Here, the fate is basically the US and the British that they're telling that if you don't do this, there's no way we're going to guarantee your dynasty. So I'm no royalist, but I see him as much more of a complicated and a tragic figure rather than a tool of the British or the Americans. But he's also very intelligent, that he can actually see the feel of the country, and that Mossadegh was, in fact, the epitome of Iranian nationalism. So you read later memoirs of the courtiers. The Shah, even after 53, to his dying days, was obsessed about Mossadegh. He couldn't get rid of the idea of Mossadegh, even though he'd overthrown him and stuff. Why? Because the question of national, nationalism. And the monarchies that have survived in the Middle East are the ones who've actually become a forefront of the national movements. The ones who've gone against nationalism are the ones who basically eventually lost out. So here I would say that if one wanted to have an assessment of the coup, it's not so useful to go back into the question of what was going on in the political groups. It's more on the larger scale of was the nationalism of the oil industry going to succeed or not. And of course, after the coup, oil was denationalized. The consortium was a facade, the facade that it was mentioned much earlier, that would give a cover of the national Iranian oil company, but in reality, control would be in the hands of a consortium of British and American companies.
Okay, so we started with a lengthy question and lengthy answer. So I would ask, please shorten your question to a minute, so we'll get more questions taken, please.
Dr. Abrahamian, I think I find your theory very interesting and almost convincing. However, there are a couple of points I wanted to mention. First is the points that Kinzer makes in his book. There is a paragraph in the book which is, I think, is of paramount importance, and that is the point he makes that he was sitting, McKay was sitting and was talking to Mossadegh, and it was everything had broken down in the negotiations. Mossadegh was going to leave Washington without an agreement signed, and then McKay asks him a question. These are not, of course, quotes because I don't remember it exactly. McKay asks Mossadegh, then after so much time that you spent here, Dr. Mossadegh, what are you going to say to the people in Iran? What are you going to take from here to them? And Mossadegh says something, I think, very ambiguous. He says, do you really think that, I don't remember the word, that rascals or those people over there would appreciate if an agreement is signed here? If I sign or I don't sign something here? And then he concludes from that. Kinzer concludes that in his opinion, Mossadegh was not going to sign any agreement. He was not planning to sign an agreement because he knew, because Mossadegh knew that the situation in Iran is so that whatever he does, a group would say that he was a traitor. That is what Kinzer says that I can remember. That is one point, and just one other point is that, I'll finish it short, okay. And that is what Mr. Parviz Mina, who is, of course, top specialist, oil specialist of National Iranian Oil Company, he says that, I can't remember where I read this, but he says that 6 different agreements were proposed to Mossadegh, to the Iranian government, And the last one, which I think the one which was brought by Harriman and was actually supported by Truman, was the one which was to the benefit of Iran and could have been signed to the benefit of the Iranian people, but Mossadegh didn't sign that because his advisors, like Mr. Sharigan, did not support it. Thank you very much. If you could please throw some light on these matters.
Yeah, I think you raised questions that actually goes back to my central point. Yeah, there were plenty of proposals, not 6, I would say maybe 60 proposals. But once you look at the proposals, the bottom line is who's going to control the industry? Is it going to be Iran or is it going to be Western companies? And in none of those proposals that they gave to him was nationalization accepted. Okay. Verbally say, yes, we accept nationalization, but when we actually get to the agreement, you will not control the oil industry, the oil companies will. So from his point of view, this was not acceptable. It wasn't just the public there. If he was really serious about nationalization, then how could you sign an agreement where it's denationalized? Now, going back to that incident in Washington, it's very interesting the way Kinzer actually summarizes that. What he misses out is a very significant incident that's often ignored. When Mossadegh was in Washington, it's usually said, well, Mossadegh took his time, he spent so much time in Washington, he went into hospitals. What's not often said, it was the Americans who wanted to keep Mossadegh here. Why? Because they thought they could get the British to come to an agreement with Mossadegh. And Mossadegh actually put an agreement on the table. He put the table. Eden told McGee, no way. It's better to have no agreement than to have a bad agreement. So you could take it the other way, that it was actually Mossadegh here that was willing to compromise, but it was the British who nixed it. And of course the Americans went along with the British nixing it. So what Kinzer is trying to do here, his argument, is again, Mossadegh was a good guy, but he made the mistake, he should have compromised. And then when you get later in the book, his explanation why, it's Mossadegh was a Shia. Shias can't compromise, martyrdom, Imam Hussein and stuff, better to die than compromise. And therefore his explanation for the failure of negotiations is not the British, it's because of Muharram. Do you want that? I don't know.
Again, please shorten your question to 1 minute, otherwise I have to cut you off.
About Dr. Mossadegh, that you explained that he failed because of it wasn't because of the communists, it was because of the oil, the nationalization of oil. But after the coup d'etat, the year after, in 1954, a lot of communists, members of the Tudeh party was executed, a big number of them, and some of them were in jail for life. But during these 25 years after coup d'etat, we always heard that the Shah said, he was scared of communists. And why do you think that he never understood the real threat and the real enemy and the real problem? And he was always blaming communists. And I even remember after he left the country in 1979 that he was interviewed by foreign journalists, and he said that now is a honeymoon, But after 3 or 4 months, Iran is going to go under their red flag. So I want to, how come a leader that who had all the power for 25 years, he didn't understood and deny the real problem? That's my question.
It's here actually you'd have to put the Shah up on a couch to understand what he's saying, to whom also. Does he really believe that communism was the threat and therefore his policy was motivated by that? Or is he saying that to particular audiences at a particular time? So if he's talking to an American audience at a Cold War, this would be a good argument to use, of course. I don't know if he actually believed in that, but it's a way of getting across to the Americans that I'm a good guy, communists are there, you better support me. Whether he actually believed that is, again, I think he was realistic enough to know that that wasn't actually a threat. I'll give you an example. In 1977, on the eve of the revolution, the Shah always used to, once a year, come to America shopping for arms. He came with a long list of arms he wanted to buy. And one of his foreign policy advisors I knew from college, he came and he phoned me up, just a private call. He said that, of course, the Shah is here to buy arms. I said, well, it's going to be hard because at that time there was a lot of bad press. The talk about a one-bullet state, can you trust so much arms going there? I said, you know, the Senate, Congress will not easily okay this. And his answer was actually very significant. He said, oh no, they will, because if they don't give the Shah the arms he wants, he'll go to the Soviet Union and get them. So what sort of logic is this? If the whole argument is a threat to the Soviet Union, how can you then at the same time say, oh, I'll go to the Soviets and get whatever I want? So there's a lot of politics involved in this, arguments that are used. Sometimes, of course, the Shah would also say the real threat to him were the British. He often clamored that the British were always out to get him. He even argued that Mossadegh was a creation of the British. Why else would Mossadegh have so much power? Everyone knows Britain had so much power in Iran. So if Mossadegh has power, it's because of the British. Does he really believe this?
Thank you.
I just wanted to say that I thought your book was excellent, and I think the way you portrayed the U.S. seemed to be very typical of how they worked in other countries at that time period and afterwards too. But my question is, I think, one always wonders, what if he didn't try to nationalize oil and had just let things evolve, and in 1973 or whenever, maybe it just would have happened anyway. So kind of in retrospect, do you think that it may have been a good idea to kind of maybe go for one of these 50-50 deals, and knowing that he wouldn't have control, but thinking maybe in the long run it may be better? And if he had done that, what would the state of democracy be like at that time and then in the upcoming decades?
Well, this is of course an argument that's often used that, again, if he was more pragmatic, it would have been all right. So why not 50-50? I think this misses the point about that nationalization is about sovereignty, independence. It's not a bread and butter issue. And the British always knew that. In fact, at one point the British said we were even willing to give Iran 60-40%, give them 60. But they said he'll never buy it because what he's interested in is about sovereignty. So one could very well say to any third world country, why not settle for semi-independence? why shouldn't Gandhi and Nehru settle for either home rule? You could have your own flag, you could claim basically you're independent, but decisions will continue to be made in London. And obviously, no Indian is going to accept that. So again, here for Iranian nationalism, giving up on nationalism would be giving up on independence.
I have a quick comment and a question. Considering the fact that McCarthyism was terrorizing a lot of progressive people internally in the United States, and this was a strategy of the United States internally and externally to make a big deal out of the Cold War problems. I think it was just obvious that they would go that route. My question now is that I understand that there is a time limit in regards to the CIA releasing supposedly documents, and I understand there are some documents that they haven't released yet. Do you know the extent of that amount of documents that they haven't released?
The American Historical Association has been for years trying to get them to release. For a long time, the CIA claimed that they had too much. They didn't have the finances to be able to sort out the documents. Then suddenly they reversed and said, in fact, a lot of the documents were shredded, so we can't release them. So we don't have enough. It's generally thought there are about another 1,000 documents that they do have. And someday, hopefully, they will see the daylight, but probably not a lifetime. But it's even the CIA, it's not just the CIA, State Department. State Department publishes every so often volumes called Foreign Relations of the United States. For Iran, for the years 51, 54, for 20 years they delayed it. Again, the American Historical Association pestered them so much that eventually they did publish the volume on Iran. But then you look at them, they're long weeks where there's no communication between Tehran embassy and Washington. You can't believe that. Crucial periods, there's no correspondence. So obviously there are things that are considered very sensitive there, that are considered still very sensitive, that are not published. And this is not 53. It's in 52. So what the US was doing in 52 in the Truman administration is actually still considered top secret. Ravam's dead, all the people there dead. So why should they be considered, so sensitive? I suspect what it was the American ambassador Henderson, who was deeply involved in the Seatir period, and he actually engineered with the British Ravam's election, and they still don't want that actually revealed. A couple of months ago, I was in London looking at British documents for 79 and stuff they've released in the last 2 years. And in the catalogue, there was one item saying a file on the discussions between the Foreign Office and the State Department on what documents to release about 53. So I said, Of course, when I went there, it's not available. So there is a file, but they still won't release it. Okay, it was 60 years after the
Recently, there are some some attempts from scholars to, it seems they try to rewrite the history in favor or in the direction of the powerful, and they even reach the point that throw this question that even independence is necessary, is something good for development or something like that. So I would like to ask you, where do you see this trend goes, and can they get concession from really people, because it seems that they're trying to push the people beliefs that some values that we have about independence, nationalism and things like that, they are not good for development, and they're writing history book that so totally different from what we think is correct. So where do you think these things goes, and do they will they be successful to do that?
I think if you look in terms of discourse, you find the present sort of international discourse is very different from the 50s. In the 50s, when a country said, I have the right to sovereignty, independence, nationalism, that was actually then accepted by international law as given. So actually the British couldn't argue against Mossadegh about nationalization, because that was basically the discourse of the time. You could nationalize. The British had nationalized industries in Britain. They couldn't very well say, no, we're against nationalization. So the question of national sovereignty was, I would say, in its heyday in the 50s. Now it's somewhat corroded. Basically, if you talk too much about independence, nationalism, it's considered sort of out of date, passé. And of course, that also then it means that it doesn't mean a much more free market or freedom. It can also mean much more power for major powers to intervene in other places. It gives them more of a legitimacy to intervene, since national sovereignty is not the top priority. So humanitarian interventionism becomes, of course, then a much more of a public discourse. And then, of course, things go bad. You can always say, well, the intentions were good.
So where do you think this goes, this trend? Where do you think this trend goes?
I'm not a prophet.
Any other question? Okay, I have a couple of questions for you, Professor Abrahamian. Number one, you mentioned about the power of Tudeh party, and in the last chapter of the book also you quote Keanu Reeves saying that they didn't have much influence and power. But apart from that argument, what in the context of the Cold War and knowing the relationship between Tudeh party and the Russians, was a takeover in the cards? I mean, was Stalin ever thinking about this, and was the possibility of the order coming down for a takeover? That's one. And the second one is, you just talked about the documents. In your research, have you seen any other case that even the governments, for example, the British, they say after 30 years they release the documents, but doesn't apply to Iran in that case. Have you seen any other case that they refuse to release the documents beside the Iran situation?
Yes, there's actually Central American cases where things are still kept secret. Indonesia, the big massacres in Indonesia. So Iran is the most visible case because of the coup, but there are other cases. And of course, with the 30-year rule means actually diplomatic papers. So MI5, MI6 papers will never be released. So there you have to use your imagination, connect the dots to figure out what they were actually doing. You can get some inkling from the Foreign Office materials, but you can't go direct to that, and you'll never get to it. So those are never going to be there. The Soviet policy. We really don't know the Soviet policy because no one's really got into the Soviet materials. So then you can speculate. If you see Stalin as a Hitler about to take over the world, then you can construct facts to fit into that. And this is, of course, what the Cold War did. And policies that Soviets had in Iran were always seen as part of Soviet expansionism. The thing is, if you are skeptical, don't start with that premise, but actually look at what evidence we have. I find that actually Soviet policy was very minimalist in Iran. It tended to be actually very cautious. Its main policy from 21 was that no foreign threat to the Soviet Union should be in Iran, i.e. no third power should have a foothold in Iran, because this was right in the soft underbelly, Baku and so on. So their long-term strategy was that Iran, if it was neutral, that would serve their interests, and that would be good enough for them. So they were quite happy with the 1921 agreement, which actually Mossadegh thought was a wonderful agreement too. Where you find Soviet policy breaks with that is with the Soviet demand for the oil concession in 1944. And again, if you look at that, you find what triggers that off. The Soviets don't just barge in and say, we want an oil agreement in the north. They come in because it was pretty well documented and rumored in the Majlis that the Iranian government was seriously thinking of giving an oil concession in the south to American and British companies. So that was already in the works, and one of the agreements would be actually to give Western companies an agreement in the north. So once that rumor got to Moscow, then that's when they put their demand about the northern one. So often in the historiography, the Soviet action is seen as the first of the actions, while it's actually a reaction to what the Western companies were doing. And of course, the Soviets got an agreement with عنوان, which was actually a 50-50 agreement, which the Majlis did not accept. Now, you would think that once the Soviets were, in a way, fooled, and it's interesting in Iskandari's book, memoirs, he says actually عنوان pulled the fast one on Stalin, Kolostarsky, and that he's actually seems to be proud of عنوان's double crossing of Stalin. But interestingly enough, once the Soviets lost that, the British and Americans just couldn't figure out why the Soviets didn't react. They just, ignored the whole thing. So it was very much, again, a passive policy. And in the 51-53 period, they were not really deeply involved in it. So when Mossadegh nationalized Shilot, the Soviets, again, didn't resist or object. In fact, Mossadegh was congratulating them for eagerly accepting nationalization. So you could say, well, this was all sinister policy. There was a front to be nice, but they had a long-term policy to take over. To prove that, you would have to get into the archives, and I'm sure if you got into archives, you wouldn't even find it. They were much more, I think, pragmatic day to day. Really, they didn't know what was going on. They were reacting to American and British policies rather than initiating policies.
Thank you very much. You're almost out of time. There are a few copies of the book, I think, still available outside. Professor Abrahamian will be here to sign for a few minutes. Thanks for being here. We'll see you in July 25th, Shahrukh Meshkin Qalam, speaking about Mirzadeh Ishqi. Shab Bakhair.